everybody. My name is Susan Deering. I'm the president of the Laguna Woods Democratic Club, and I'd like to welcome you to our program today. For the July program, we are honored to have with us Dr. Thomas Parham, who is the president of the California State University, Dominguez Hills. He will be speaking on exploring our responsibilities around racism. I would like to thank many people involved with this program, Dr. Fran Williams for having put us in touch with Dr. Parham, Deborah David, who corresponded with Bernadine Grayer, who is the presidential aide to Dr. Parham, Pat Leftwich for setting up the Zoom and recording, Rebecca Gilad for doing the questions, Alan Feldman for doing the timing, Jean Lepowski for doing the moment of reflection, and all of you for tuning in. And now I would like to turn the program over to Jean Lepowski, who will be doing our moment of reflection. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to talk about something that Isaac Asimov said. Isaac Asimov was an immigrant from Russia before it became the part of the Soviet Union. He was a biochemist and an educator and a prolific writer for the general audience. One of his probably most known works is a collection of stories called I, Robot, published in 1950, which describes the 3 laws of robotics, which have become commonly known both in the general public and by the robotics community. In the mid-20th century, as you may all recall, there was this attitude of science can fix everything and man can dominate nature. And then there was the Sputnik, which prompted the entire space race and focused on science education. And Asimov's 3 laws of robotics describe how humans and robots should interact. And in fact, robotics was a term that was invented by Asimov, the writer, as opposed to the scientist. And that is the name of that science now. But nevertheless, one of the things that Asimov observed is that even as far back as 1980, he said there is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. He says, the strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge.
We couldn't, thank you, Jean. We couldn't have someone better to speak to us today about the importance of education than Dr. Thomas Parham. And right now I would like to introduce Fran Williams, who is going to introduce him. Many of you in the village may know her as the founder of the African American Heritage Club. She's also a member of the City of Laguna Woods Civic Support Funding Board, former member of the OC Grand Jury, and current member of the State Grand Jury Association. And we're honored to have her as a member of the Democratic Club and also on a member of our African American Committee. Dr. Fran Williams, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am honored to be the person introducing Dr. Parham. And because I know that you're in for a tremendous treat in hearing from him, I'd like to not spend a whole lot of time making the introduction. If I were to formally introduce him, it would take all the time that we had. But I'd like to share with you, Dr. Parham is a national, international speaker, actually, and he is one who brings to many communities the consciousness of how we live, what our culture is about, specifically the African American culture. Dr. Parham has served as leader in education for a number of years, dating back to the 80s, where he served as professor of psychology at the University of Irvine. He also served at UC Irvine as the assistant, I lost my thought, as the assistant chancellor, the vice chancellor at UC Irvine, working in student affairs office. Dr. Parham is revered actually in the African American community specifically, and in his creation of work for developing young men. He now has developed a program that is copied nationally in looking at how we work with, how we develop, how we explore the idea of leaders in the African American community with young boys, and has tremendous success in moving the young men from childhood to manhood. And I think their mantra is something about moving into manhood, having a passport through learning. I'd like to introduce to you the professor, the president of California State University at Dominguez Hills, but more importantly, an elder of sorts for the African American community in our lifestyle, our history, and our work toward the promise of success. I give to you Dr. Thomas Parham. Tommy? Or Dr.
Thank you very much.
Parham?
Thank you. Let me begin my remarks by, first of all, thanking Dr. Fran Williams. Fran Williams is someone that I have known forever. She's been an icon, I think, in this Orange County community forever. And when Fran Williams calls, you just say, yes, ma'am, and you try to do what you do to accommodate that. She's a warrior with a warrior spirit, has a heart of gold for always making a difference in the lives of young people. And the best thing about my relationship with her is that we are friends and really family. And so it's my pleasure to begin my remarks by thanking her and really the Laguna Woods Democratic Club for the invitation to visit and talk with you this morning. Let me also, as I begin, extend my appreciation and thanks really to Sue Deering and Deborah David and Alan Feldman, I think, and Pat Leftwich for the assistance with the logistics and preparing for this presentation, and all the other folk who were involved in helping us really put this together. Now, in beginning my address to you this morning, I want to bring you greetings from the California State University, Dominguez Hills, one of 23 campuses in the California State University system, where I have the privilege of serving as president. We have some 17,700 students. It is not a little place anymore. So we're actually over enrolled with 6 colleges, 69 majors, I think 48 undergrad and 21 graduate, and a noble mission where we are seeking to transform lives that transform America. So I bring you greetings from them as well. Now, within the context of my remarks this morning, you'll be able to identify several assumptions that you'll hear in my presentation. And these 5 or 6 assumptions include the following. First, if you don't understand racism and white supremacy, what it is and how it functions, then everything else you think you understand will only confuse you. Those are the words of the late Frances Cress Welsing, a formidable African-American psychiatrist, as well as Neely Fuller. Secondly, if we're going to talk about our responsibilities around racism, I've titled this presentation, Exploring Our Responsibilities Around Racism, Distinguishing Passive Observers from Authentic Drum Majors. Distinguishing passive observers from authentic drum majors. Now, the assumption here is that racism is not simply attitudes and behaviors of bias, of bigotry and discrimination held by a single individual, but rather it has several dimensions that I want to try to make sure we unpack this morning. There's an individual dimension where we're talking about that prejudice and bigoted beliefs and attitudes. There's a systemic domain to racism, which is about racial bias across institutions like public policy, schools, healthcare, environmental justice, et cetera. There's institutional racism, which is an intersection of what I call the social entities whose racial bias permeates every level of the institution. For example, if it's in the criminal justice system, it's police and DAs and prosecutors and judges and prisons and probation and parole, et cetera. That's the institutional variety. And then there's organizational racism, where implicit or explicit racist policies and or rules that reinforce racial inequity, in fact, are enforced and very pervasive. The third assumption I make is that racism should not be the problem for African-American folk, Latinx folk, Asian American folk, or American, Indian, and indigenous peoples of this world. For me, and I say this as a psychologist, it is the responsibility of brothers and sisters in the white community to address and confront racism and clean up their own house. Fourth, I want to invite you to consider a different definition of power. Power, my friends, is not simply about military might or who has, the biggest, baddest police force or the highest position in an organization or even the most money. Real power is the ability to define reality and to make other people respond to that definition as if it were their own. And so real power, right, is lost in places like, right, democratic parties, right, in this country, because we lose our power when we allow other people to define and frame the discourse and the narratives that others then react to. We've got to be able to seize that back. And the fifth assumption I make is that enhanced awareness and sensitivity is substantially different than authentic equality. And I'll try to lay that point out. So with those assumptions, let me begin. Now, in my prior Zoom meeting with Sue and Deborah and Fran and other folk and the leadership, I was asked about kind of strategies for self-reflection. So I thought that I'd talk for a moment just about something that we're all familiar with, which is living. See, in my mind, living is about active engagement. It's about the animation of that divine spark that gives humans their beingness. Living is breathing, living is growing, living is maturing, right? And as it moves through those spaces, it's about the incorporation of ritual into our daily activity in ways that allow us to meet our most basic needs. And so living, my friends, is an act of self-examination, where one seeks to close the gap between the values-driven and virtuous self one aspires to be and the real self that navigates the world every day with our flaws and imperfections. And so that notion relates to that, what we call the alchemical process of human transformation toward perfectibility. Let me say that again. That alchemical process of human transformation toward perfectibility. We be in the moment, but while we be, we're always in a state of becoming more better, right? That's the essence of being and becoming. It's what Socrates argued when he was clear, when he uttered the dictum, an unexamined life is not worth living. Now, in my case, by way of self-disclosure, there was a great Algerian psychiatrist, Frantz Fanon, who asserted that for people of African descent like me, and I would argue for all people, quite frankly, whether you are white, black, blue, brown, or purple, people should be able to ask and answer three fundamental questions. They are, number one, who am I? Number two, am I who I say I am? And am I all I ought to be? Who am I is a question of identity. What is my nature, my essence, my character? Am I who I say I am is a question of congruence, meaning what is the level of congruence between what I preach and what I practice? Am I all I ought to be is a question of actualizing potential, meaning with all the gifts that I have been blessed with as an individual, am I utilizing those gifts to their fullest? And however the Creator has blessed me, whatever you call him or her. Now, given that, I suspect that I should continue this presentation in exploring our responsibilities around racism, not with really a recitation of the academic credentials and honors and awards that Dr. Williams talked about. That's what I do for a living. But what I want to begin with is really a notion and discussion of who I am at the core of my being, because there you might find the essence of an individual, right? And how family and circumstance have really shaped the person that I have become. I give credit, first of all, to an individual named Dr. Joseph White, who was my first mentor, who provided me and others with a very deliberate socialization as mentors do. And along the way, he taught me life lessons that have stayed with me, even to this day, as a president of a university. First, he taught me that you cannot seek validation from your oppressor. So with people trying to oppress you, it is not important really to get their validation. Secondly, he taught me that excellence will bring opportunity, produce excellence. Third, he taught me when you go to graduate school, he says, I'm not sending you there to be just clinically good as a psychologist. He says, I expect you to be good clinically, academic instruction-wise and research-wise, and then consulting, so that you have to master everything, right, that you do, because you never know where opportunities will lie. And then he taught me that the key to mental health, particularly for a young Black man, was always having a broad range of choices and options. And so it's those options that I sought out in my career and has helped me really navigate this notion of the world that is so impacted by this notion of race and racism. Now, subsequently, I realized and internalized another fundamental lesson that was really introduced to me by the great Asa Hilliard, the late Asa Hilliard, I should also say as well, profound psychologist and chematologist. But he also reminds us all the times that there's something wrong with an educational system and with a world. So we're talking American culture here that leaves people strangers to themselves, aliens to their culture, oblivious to their condition, and inhuman to their oppressors. So think about that a second. Imagine African-American people growing up in a world where, whether they're in schools or healthcare or criminal justice or something, they are strangers to themselves. So they're cut off from their history, aliens to their culture, oblivious to their condition, and seen as inhuman to people who would oppress them. So my life has really been, right, a quest to not be a stranger to myself, to not be an alien to my culture. So I've tried to examine and explore culture at the deep structural level, not just the surface structural level. Understanding that culture is not simply demographics, but rather a complex constellation of mores and values and customs and traditions that provide a general design for living and a pattern for interpreting reality. I've tried to not be, right, oblivious to my condition and be conscious of the condition of both myself and my people. So I've never been a fan of getting my hair relaxed because I didn't need my mind, right, anything other than crisp and sharp. Nor have I wanted contact lenses to color my eyes because I never wanted my vision to be clouded by the realities of life in America for people of color. And fourth, I've never yielded to someone else's definition of my humanity, instead believing, my friends. And what I constantly teach young people, which is what Dr. Williams is talking about, is that each of us, irrespective of your color, gender, right, or creed, each of us is a seed of divinely inspired possibility, which when nurtured in its proper context, it can and will grow into the fullest expression of all we are supposed to become. Now, in my life, I've also come to understand and really stylize the piece of African wisdom that indicates that life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. Let me say that again. Life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. Has a lot of different meanings. But one of those is sometimes our greatest strength can also be our greatest weakness. But sometimes our greatest weakness can be our greatest strength. It just depends on the context. And culturally, my life has been a blend of both the Martin Luther Kings of the world and the Malcolm X's of the world, because each of them represents different polarities in the struggle for, right, self-affirmation and dignity and just survival in America. There's an integrationist side that represents King. There's a culturally nationalist side that represents Brother Malcolm and Garvey and others. And so in balancing an integration versus nationalist ideology in my own life space, right, I have in my spirit just as much Martin as I do Malcolm. And speaking of Brother Martin, I would remind you to, or invite you really to read a text called Strength to Love, if you haven't, 1963, if I remember right, because it provided me with a formula, the secret sauce, if you will, to successfully negotiate the pathways to productivity and success. Because what Martin Luther King asserted was that you had to have a tough mind and a tender heart. So in my life, I can say without hesitation that I've learned to do both. And in fact, on my conference table behind me, in fact, you can see a small replica of an Ashanti stool that was given to me by my colleagues in the Association of Black Psychologists while in Ghana, Africa, with a plaque on it that says Warrior Healer. It really is the best synthesis of opposites that I have. And so that healer's heart, I've sought to embrace the tender side of my existence, while also sometimes, right, contrary to the ways Western society teaches men to be, and informs the way I approach people and circumstance. But I've also tried to have a very tough mind, because having a tough mind was really important to be able to navigate the space. And so when we think about the subject of racism and the subject is raised, right, and systems of denial are given center stage and more realistic appraisals of situations are ushered in to the background of the conversation, that becomes very difficult. What am I saying? I'm saying that admittedly, I've learned, right, very well that as you have minuses and pluses in life and decide on which course of action to be able to take, that the best course of action is to be able to engage in an authentic appraisal of your reality so that you don't become oblivious to your condition, rather than sit in silence or in denial about the situation and things going on, which is what I think a lot of America does. So in speaking to you all this morning, I think we can still identify, right, in our racial tension and social strife that really is just gripping this nation. And despite a new Democratic administration in the White House, I think the plague of unchecked assaults and traumatic violence aimed at Black and brown and poor people of this nation leaves all of us stunned, sickened, in some cases nauseated. And my heart goes out to families of the George Floyds of the world, the Breonna Taylors of the world, the Ahmaud Arbery's of the world, and the countless other families who live in pain, right, that they have lost loved ones to senseless violence. But so too did our hearts go out for Amadou Diallo and Abner Louima in New York, Rodney King in Los Angeles, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Eric Garner in New York, Trayvon Martin in Florida, 12-year-old Tremere Rice in Cleveland, Philando Castile in Minneapolis, Sandra Bland in Texas, Latasha Harlins right in LA. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon that America's now waking up in. We are just catching it on camera when they thought nobody was looking. And the incidents in places like Minneapolis in the aftermath of the Floyd murder bring into sharp focus the raw pain, the anger, the hurt, the anxiety, the fear, the outrage that people are feeling. And so when human rights are so violently violated, liberties so thoroughly trounced, freedom so frivolously forgotten, humanity so profoundly disrespected, and cries for relief from the pain and suffering being inflicted are so callously disregarded, it makes sense to strike back at systems and institutions that people perceive as oppressing you. Why are we surprised that we see people in the streets? But if you look at other people's frame about, look at those violent folk out there, you know, it looks very different than if you understand that people are simply reacting to the pain that they have been subjected to. And really, I understand the impulse completely, not just a psychologist, but being a human being. And yet when legitimate forms of freedom of speech and demonstration and protest and social advocacy deteriorate into that rioting and looting of stores and businesses that people depend on for daily subsistence, I think such behaviors must be guarded and guided by higher principles that instigated our outrage in the first place, right? I'm not condoning the looting and the rioting. I simply understand it. But while Brunswick and Louisville and Minneapolis and all these places around the country are sometimes hundreds of miles away from Southern California, my Dominguez Hills campus and where you are right now in Orange County, I'm cognizant that there are teachable moments in these tragedies and that institutions of higher education and community organizations like the Laguna Woods Democratic Club have a role to play in addressing the ills of our nation. Brother Fanon was clear. Frantz Fanon, I'm talking about now, that Algerian psychiatrist, that each generation out of relative obscurity must reach out and seek to fulfill its legacy or betray it. So as we conduct our affairs, right, it's important to remember and interrogate that question yourself as you just examine your own life, even in your senior space and season of your life. Am I living that life to fulfill or betray a legacy that I've been blessed to inherit? I get up every day with that question on my mind. I'm also reminded in this moment, my friends, back to Dr. King, because it was Dr. King who reminds us that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. So I remember his sermon, The Drum Major Instinct, where he offered each of us a new definition of greatness, believing that everyone could be great because everyone could serve, particularly if people could transform that need in all of us that wants to be first in the drum major and to be important and first in line and first in charge and first in whatever. He said, it's a good instinct if you use it right. But if he wants us to be first, he expects us to be first in moral excellence. And so that raises a fundamental question about moral excellence and the explicit behaviors that stand in sharp contrast to that standard of conduct, and how too many people in my mind sit in silence as passive observers to immoral activity as if they have no role to play. In his text, Where Do We Go From Here? Just a quick history lesson. Where Do We Go From Here, my friends, was written in 1967. Now, it's interesting that King assesses the legislative achievements, which are pretty phenomenal. 1964 is, right, the Civil Rights Act. 1965, the Voting Rights Act, two of the most historic pieces of legislation in history. So why is King writing a book in 66 that gets published in 67, asking where do we go from here? Because he was talking about the delayed implementation of those mandates because of the deference to states' rights, reasoning that while the movement was able to instigate increased sensitivity and empathy in American citizens, it was not able to usher in a commitment for the politicians in charge and the broader, larger white community to wrestle with how to create real equity in the lives of Black and other oppressed people. So we had more sensitivity. People were sad looking at the dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham. They were sad looking at the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and John Lewis getting beat down. But while it piqued their awareness and raised that sensitivity, it hadn't ushered in true equality. We are in the same moment now, all these many years later, right? About what is it that we can do, right? To not just have our sensitivity enhanced, but rather use, right, deliberate and intentional action to be able to usher in some true measure of equality. And so I'm very cognizant of the fact, my friends, that progress has been made, right, in the years since I was a child, and certainly since King and Malcolm were walking this earth, right? And even as a young adult, no question about it. If you look at advances in technology and transportation and communications and media and healthcare and athletics and space exploration and scientific discoveries and political appointments to high office, right? All those are a testament to the growth and development of our society. But I'm also aware that the level of resistance to continued progress and empowerment of a people is equally pronounced and even more sophisticated than it historically has been. Look at what's going on in the voter suppression tactics in states all around this country. Poverty, my friends, is still a norm for too many of our nation's children. Racism is still an infectious disease on the health of this nation and a stain on this experiment we call democracy. Violence, right, against Black, brown, poor people, women, continues unabated in cities and suburbs of this country, particularly but not exclusively among those in the law enforcement community who are just abusing their privilege. And we salute police officers who keep us safe and guarantee the safety and security we sleep under every night. But we deplore racist policing that would do some of the things that you've now caught them on candid camera looking at. Women continue to receive less pay for equal work. Discrimination against the physically challenged and others who are LGBTQ is still a challenge we as a society have yet to overcome. Education is still unequal at K-12 levels. Too many colleges and universities in this nation contribute to a climate where higher education is treated as a privilege of the few rather than a fundamental right of the many. And you know what's interesting? We have fitness machines to help us build more muscle to finely tune our bodies. And yet we have no machines to help us better love one another across the demographic boundaries or create more enlightened levels of compassion and sensitivity to people whose lives are lived at the margins of society. In essence, much has changed and very little has changed. As I prepare to close, it raises a question of what are our responsibilities around eradicating racism and what distinguishes a passive observer from an authentic drum major. Fundamentally, each of us, my friends, has to decide, are you prepared to fulfill versus betray the legacy of the ancestors has left us? Are you prepared to dignify our struggle against oppression and push back against social inequities, or live with the understanding of conforming to social norms that continue to oppress people, all the while helping us feel more comfortable with our station in life? We've got to ask, are you prepared to move past the valleys of human degradation and strive to reach the plateaus of racial reconciliation and a greater respect for human authenticity, which requires activity? We've got to have activity where you speak out. We've got to invite you to write commentary for local and national newspapers and periodicals when you see something wrong. We've got to find a way to use your gifts to improve the life space of others and the condition in other people's lives through your volunteering. We've got to advocate for change in public policy, including police reforms. We've got to insist on increasing measures of accountability for those who are supposed to protect and serve us in public. We've got to donate and philanthropically engage not just your favorite charity, but ones that assist racially different and marginalized groups with the things that they need, not with what we think they need. We've also got to decide if you're prepared to strive for a truly equitable society and a sharing of power and privilege, or simply wallow in the pools of enhanced sensitivity, unmotivated to initiate real and substantive change in other people's lives with their hardship and pain. And we've got to ask ourselves the difficult question, and this is a difficult question, which is, how can I bear witness to the racism and suffering of African-American, Latinx, Asian American, and Native American indigenous people, sit in silence and still maintain my humanity? Let me say that again. You've got to ask yourself, and all of us have to interrogate that fundamental question of how do we bear witness to the racism and suffering of African-American, Latinx, Asian American, and Native American indigenous people. Sit in silence when we see that happening and still maintain our humanity. We all have to decide if we're committed to be drum majors for justice, equality, peace, and righteousness, and help create the change we want to see in the world, or passive observers afraid or unwilling to risk our station because it grates against the social norm of inequality. We have to decide what kind of world do we want to live in. And as I prepare to close, I'm reminded, my friends, of the writings of my friend Cornel West. Brother West is fond of saying that we should never allow misery to have the last word. So as you emerge from Laguna Woods Democratic Club meeting today, or this broadcast, and interrogate the question of whether you wish to be a passive observer or an authentic drum major for justice, peace, and righteousness. Commit yourselves, my friends, to be bold enough to challenge inequality, brave enough to speak out against social injustice, courageous enough to stand on principle and moral integrity, secure enough to resist the social validation from people who oppress you, and sometimes you don't even like, or they don't like you in the first place, and conscious enough to know that turning a blind eye to social misery can never be anything more than a momentary place of comfort and convenience. With that, I'll stop and take some questions. Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Parham, you certainly gave us a lot to think about and certainly a lot to live up to. There are some questions for you, but I would like to ask one of my questions first. You talked about the necessity of white society cleaning up its own house. And so my question to you is, do you think that ethnic studies programs are on both the university and high school, other levels, are effective at helping us to clean up our own house?
They are a good start, but I think not the whole picture I think that we need. So ethnic studies programs are essential because the level of ignorance in this country is just so profound and pervasive that ethnic studies allow us to really understand and reveal culture at the deep structure level. So those courses are essential. So yes, but once you have that enhanced awareness, once you can get rid of it and interrogate the biases and assumptions that we bring with us into our civic or educational spaces, whatever they might be, the question is, what do you do about that? I mean, here's what's interesting. I probably have, as Dr. Williams would tell you, more degrees and letters and awards behind my name than most people have fingers and toes combined. I've had a blessed life. But if I take off and put on my Nike sweatsuit, which I'm subject to be walking around in Orange County on any weekend, or I'm up in LA, right, where I am today at the campus, and I walk down the street, I can be subject to being pulled over and up against the wall because they don't see Dr. Parham. I've lectured all over this country and this world. I can walk down almost any street in America, right? Particularly in suburban places. Walk down the street, have somebody see me and go, uh-oh, when they see me coming. They will cross the street, keep going, and then recross the street again when they think it's safe. Because they don't see Dr. Parham. What they see, right, is only 3 images I can be on TV, which is where most of us get our cultural information. I either have to be an entertainer, an athlete, or a criminal. And I gotta believe if they thought I was an entertainer and athlete, they'd be running to get my autograph. What creates that kind of anxiety and fear in our citizenry that they would even cross the street from folk like me, and I ain't nothing but a regular brother from round the way, right, with a whole bunch of degrees. But that's what we have to be able to work with. So the ethnic studies is important and imperative to help us dispel and confront some of the biases that we've all grown up with. You can't grow up in America and not have racism, sexism, homophobia in you. That's absolutely true. Lastly, I'll say to your question, one of the reasons I think the isms don't change is because we've all not learned to be advocates for one another. Sexism doesn't change because the only people who scream about it are women. Sexism is not a woman's problem, it's a man's problem. And until men decide that we're going to clean up our own house, it's not going to change. The reason racism doesn't change is because the only people who scream about it are the people who are oppressed. Those 4 groups I mentioned. It's not going to change until brothers and sisters in the white community just say, we are not going for this. And I need to be clear. The actual David Dukes of the world are relatively few. They're about as inconvenient as a fly on an elephant's backside. I don't worry about them. I worry about the 53% of the people who voted for him. The Trumps of the world, to me, are irrelevant. He was a knucklehead before he became the president. What I worry about are all the folk who bought the thing, who gave away their power and sold out to the narrative that he created. And then went and acted like that, even as he backpedaled and moonwalked away from all of that responsibility. right? That's not, that's what I worry about. So I'm trying to invite other people to say, if racism is out there, it isn't a problem that Black folk created. It's a problem that brothers and sisters in the white community created. They've got to clean up their own house, and it'll get cleaned up when they decide to do something about that. Great question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Parham. Rebecca Gilad now has some questions from the chat that she's going to ask.
Hi, Rebecca.
I do have some questions from people that have been putting them on chat and others that have been sending them in different ways. And it seems that there are two kinds. Some questions that want to know more about your personal life and your personal struggle, and questions that you have addressed in one way or another that have to do with what can we do. So let me start.
Okay.
What is the best thing that white people can do to support the education of African Americans? And outside of education, what is the best thing they can do to help bring equality?
So relative to education, I think education is the civil rights issue of our day. And the best thing you can do in education is support educational endeavors. What's true, particularly for us in California, I'm a product of California education. I have an undergraduate degree from the University of California at Irvine, Washington University of St. Louis, Illinois, and then I was an Ivy League professor at the University of Pennsylvania before I got recruited to come back here to California. In that space, California system of higher education is one of the best in the whole world. But while it used to be free, I paid $0 for tuition and the state paid it all. And then it started doing this. So that in about 2010, we crossed the threshold so that while what families pay, right, is more than what the state puts in per people in that space. And so we go back and forth like this every year, but it still costs us tuition and fees on top of that. Well, imagine a space like me at Dominguez Hills and why I'm here doing this work and why I left Irvine, right? Which was a wonderful space, loved it. I'm an anteater to the bone, but that's a space of privilege. My students are 85% students of color, 87 actually, on this campus. I've got 66% Latinx kids, 12% African-American kids. That's the largest percentage of Black students of any university in the state of California. I have about 8% Asian American students, about 7.5% Caucasian, less than 1% Native American, but I've got 87% students of color. So I have culturally different kids. I have 65% of my kids are first generation. 73% of my students are Pell eligible. Those are the Pell grants that come from the federal government. 60% of them have an EFC. That's an expected family contribution of $0. The families are so economically challenged, they can't even afford $1 that we don't charge them. And, right, they come from high school, some of them, no fault of their own, where they aren't prepared to manage the rigors of a university curriculum. Now, high underrepresented minority, high first gen, high Pell eligible, high in need of some level of remediation. Stack that up against any of the UCs and even some of the Cal States. There are universities in this country and in this state in particular that have less than 0.5% of those variables in aggregate. And you have universities like mine on top where 50% of my students represent those 4 variables. So their ability to get through and get college degrees to have a trajectory that increases in life is only impacted by the generosity of folk who can contribute their time and their bounty to provide scholarship dollars. I mean, think about this. For every $1 million I can raise as a president, that is $205,000 scholarships or $2,500 scholarships, each of which would take about 10 hours of work a week off the back of a student. And if I can take that 10 hours a week off the back of my students and put them in the libraries or mentoring with faculty in their labs and other stuff, I can improve the increasing rates. That's the way that we create equity in society when it's not equal in the first place. Those are great examples of that. But education is absolutely essential to be able to get that done. So I'm a big fan of that. What can we do? I think we think about contributing. I think we think about volunteering. I think we take lawyers and we put in volunteer offices to help folk who are DACA recipients and need immigration reform. We take old school teachers, right, who are retired but still have that good base of knowledge. And we go into communities and we work with folk to supplement what it is our public schools are teaching or not teaching some of these students so that they're better ready to manage the rigors of a university curriculum. I think we take our dollars and think about contributing to those educational institutions to just name scholarships, even in the names of your own families, who would then help out and support some of these students so that we take the burden of work off of their back so that they can get through and their social mobility goes up, as does the trajectory of the entire family if these students can finish college degrees. Those are the kind of things that we do.
Wow. One more question. How can Democrats take back the power to define reality?
Not sit in silence. We sit in silence too long. I remember in the Obama administration, he hadn't even, now I never thought I'd see in my lifetime an African-American president in the White House and a first family that just looked like that, model ideal. But he hadn't even unpacked the boxes yet. Walking down in the parade the first day, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell was writing memos that said, we will make it our business to give him no political victories. He wouldn't think about the country. He wouldn't think about what's in the best interest of all the people. He said, we are going to make it more difficult for him to have any legislative success, which not only impacts his agenda, but it impacts negatively upon the wealth of the country. And Democrats sat in silence through a lot of that. Even when we came to elections, we allowed a whole election with Hillary Clinton going in after that to be about some emails, right? And we allowed someone like a Donald Trump to get into the White House to do the kind of work he did 600,000 lives later that we lost, right? And all the destruction I think that he engaged in, because he said to people, I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and still get elected. And he was right. We thought, oh, you must be tripping, right? I could brag about sexually assaulting a woman on tape. I got him on tape. And 53% of the women still voted for Trump in the election. That's just straight up denial. And I got a different word for it if I was putting my clinical hat on being a psychologist, right? But that's the kind of piece we have to get through. And all the denial I think that's there. How do we seize back the power? We have to write. We have to speak out, right? All we have to do is unmute our voices, take the zipper off and unmute them and begin to speak out. Because when more people speak out, that's what changes the narrative. When more people volunteer and get involved, that's what changes the narrative. I don't mind the one person chirping over here. What I mind is the 50 over here that sit in silence because it's there. I mean, think about this for a minute. How many of us have ever been in a small group where someone told a sexist joke? Anybody? Or someone told a racist joke, yeah? And we knew it wasn't funny, but we sat in silence. All that did was reinforce the probability, even if somebody laughed, that that person was gonna say that again. All it would take was one voice to say, that ain't funny. You sure are sensitive. You're right. That is not funny. What does it do? It won't change that attitude. What it will do is change that behavior so that it doesn't come out again. Why? Because, right, there's a social condemnation that exists when all the people rise up to say, no, there's a different standard of decency and normality that we have to implement in our life. And that's what doesn't happen, I think, in our democratic politics and in our democracy. There are too many of us that are sitting in silence instead of getting involved and active. It's what John Lewis used to call good trouble. If you got to get in good trouble to be able to make a difference, then get in some good trouble.
We have so many questions. I hope we can get through all of them.
I'll try to be short in my answer, so give me a couple of them.
Okay, could you please define a tough mind?
So a tough mind is what I call a warrior spirit. That comes out of that King quote, Strength to Love, his book, where he said the formula was to have a tough mind and a tender heart. So I've got to be very conscious about the gut bucket racism that is very prevalent and pervasive in American society. But I have to also have a tender heart where I can't just indict all of America, everybody white, everybody this, nobody of any race is all of anything. There are pockets of good and bad in every place. And so we've got to be able to move in that space. So the tender heart has to be able to recognize that people in their heart are compassion, that people in their heart right, have good intent toward others. But a tough mind also has to remember that if I see somebody defining and framing my discourse in a way, right, that is oppressing my spirit, that is, right, derogatory toward me or my people, then I've got to be able to exercise my voice and speak out. So you'll find me with a warrior spirit where my eye is not going to blink, nor my knees going to buckle, not 1 inch, about standing up for what is right and truthful, right, in this world, right? And I'm prepared to take whatever comes with that, even if I have to lose, right, privilege in order to get that done. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. So I try to be principled and not there. I try to not be a fan of democratic sanity, Rebecca. Democratic sanity means I'm prepared to go along with it just because the majority does. Right? Segregation was one point the law of the land. Didn't mean I was going for it. We can't just engage in those things with that.
How about this question, Dr. Parham? When I was growing up in LA, Orange County was known to be very conservative and white. How have you seen the environment since you first moved to Orange County?
Orange County was a haven for John Birch society and John Wayne. Orange County was known as being kind of a racist place. And those of us who were in LA, even when my wife is from New Jersey, and we met at the University of Pennsylvania, and when she found out I was being recruited back here to Irvine, and we decided to get married and we were coming back here, this was 36, 38 years ago, we came back and she was kind of like, we're going behind the orange curtain. I mean, that's what we used to call it because it had that reputation there. And the folk who were here did nothing really to change it. And even your business enterprises, you know, we're in that same space. Has it changed? Yes, it's gotten much more liberal. And I don't mind, I think you have to have two parties, you know, 3 parties, 4 parties, or whatever democracy demands. You've got to, I love the fact that we have a democracy that has Republicans and Democrats. I love the fact that you have conservatives and liberals. I love the fact because people should not be punished for their ideas. But when your ideas bleed into a space that dehumanizes someone's humanity and denigrates it because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, because of their disability, because of their sexual orientation, whatever it might be, that's when we cross the line in that. And what we've seen, I think, in Orange County is a more humanistic wave of trying to accept and acknowledge, I think, people for who they are fundamentally. But there are still pockets of bad that happen in Orange County as well. It's not the perfect panacea. It's illusion that it has that. But we just have to be able to grow up in spaces that are different. I mean, look at what happens in some of your schools. You can go down into not far from where you folk are in Laguna Woods and look at Elise and O'Gale and look at the challenges they've had there in the school systems. Look at the challenges we had even in some of the Irvine schools. They used to call me up about, they would call Fran Williams about. Look at some of the challenges they've had in Huntington Beach. And we got, you know, rednecks and other folk out there with signs and whatever. And, you know, it's not, it's just, you know, it's still very pervasive, but it's much better now than it was before. And I've seen it grow partly because of the growth of the university and there's a more educated citizenry, but also because I think people have decided to help change their communities for the better. I think political leadership has been there, even though we have some that are still kind of out and out, you know, in that other zone that we try not to talk about a lot.
Dr. Parham, I'm truly sorry that there is only time for one more question. So let me ask it.
Rebecca, I think there is not time for one more question.
No.
Sorry.
Oh, no.
No,
Could
sorry.
we have Dr. Parham come back for 3 or 4 or 5 more times, please?
I think that's what we'll have to do. Okay. I would like to thank you, Rebecca, and I'd like to thank everybody again involved with this program. Dr. Parham, I do want to leave you one last minute to say something to wrap up. I know that one of the most important messages that I got from this is that we need to call out all the isms that we see. We cannot remain silent, and we're going to contact your aide to find out where we should request donations to be sent for CSU at Dominguez Hills. So if you would just like to say one more word, Dr. Parham, thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to simply end with a vote of thanks, both to all of you, to my friend, Dr. Fran Williams, and to Sue and Deborah and Rebecca and Pat and all of you who had a hand in bringing me to talk to you today. I'll end where I started with a quote from Dr. King. He reminds us, my friends, that life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are we doing for others? And in that way, I think we all help to fulfill rather than betray the legacy that we've been blessed to inherit in this world. With that, I'll stop and say it's been my pleasure. Much love to everybody. I thank you for allowing me to be in your space today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parham, and thank you to all of us who have joined us here today. Nothing but kudos for everything that you have said. If only we can live up to your words. And thanks to all of you for tuning in today. And thanks to TV6 for letting us air these programs. And Dr. Williams, again, thank you for bringing us Dr. Parham. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.